August the 28th, 1982. Danholm Island, off the coast of Sweden. The house was the house she had owned for several years, the specific quality of a Scandinavian summer house. Simple in the way that the Scandinavian aesthetic understands simplicity, organized around the light and the water and the particular quality of the northern summer that people who grew up in Sweden understand as the specific form of beauty that belongs to that geography. And that does not translate entirely to other geographies. She had been there for the summer. Not for the whole summer, she had been in London for portions of it, for the professional engagements that continued even in this summer, even in this specific summer, which was the summer she knew was the last one. She had come to Danholm for the final weeks. On the morning of August the 28th, she could not get out of bed. Not in the way of the ordinary difficulty of a morning, the specific inability of a body that has reached the point at which the reaching is no longer possible in the way it had been possible, even yesterday. She called her daughter Pia Lindström, the daughter of the first marriage, who was a television journalist in New York and who was the daughter who had been the closest to her in the specific way of closeness that the history of the mother and this particular daughter had produced. Not uncomplicated, not the closeness of a relationship without difficulty, but the closeness of two women who had navigated the specific difficulty of what the history between them had contained, and who had arrived, in the later years, at something that was genuinely warm in a way that the earlier years had not always been. She said, "I think it's time." Pia came. She came from New York to Danholm, to the summer house with the light and the water. She was there on the 29th of August, which was Ingrid Bergman's 67th birthday. The birthday was the last birthday. The last summer was ending. She died on the 29th of August, 1982. She died on her birthday, which is the specific coincidence that the people who loved her have described across the subsequent decades as the thing that is both random and somehow not random. The way that the most significant things in a life sometimes organize themselves around the specific dates that the life has given them. She was 67 years old. She had been, across the 67 years, the most internationally celebrated actress of her generation. Not the most celebrated in the American commercial sense, not the most celebrated in the specific terms of the studio system that had made her famous in America, but the most celebrated in the deeper sense of the person whose work had been received across the widest range of cultural contexts, with the consistent recognition that the work deserved. She had had everything. She had lost a great deal of it in the specific ways that the life had required it to be lost, and the losing had been as public as the having had been, which is the specific quality of Ingrid Bergman's relationship to her own life. That the having and the losing were both conducted in the full public view of a world that had decided it had a stake in what happened to her, for reasons that the first 30 years of her career had produced and that she had not chosen and could not undo. Tonight, my friend, I want to tell you the full story. Not the scandal story. That story has been told in the way of stories that are organized around the scandal rather than around the person the scandal happened to, and the person deserves better than the scandal story. The full story. The story of what she had and what she lost and what the losing cost and what it produced and what the final summer on Danholm Island contained when she called her daughter and said, "I think it's time. Come with me." We are going back to Stockholm in the year 1915. Ingrid Bergman was born on the 29th of August, 1915, in Stockholm, Sweden. She was born on the 29th of August, which was the date on which she would die 67 years later. And the specific circularity of the birth and the death sharing the date is one of those biographical facts that the biography of a person of her specific public significance tends to assign the significance of meaning, while the honest account notes it and declines to assign it the meaning that the assigning would require more certainty about what dates mean than the honest account can provide. Her father was Justus Bergman, a photographer and a man of artistic sensibility, who had the specific quality of warm, engaged paternity that the subsequent accounts of Ingrid's relationship to her father describe with the consistency of accounts that are describing something genuinely good, genuinely warm, genuinely present, genuinely the kind of father who pays attention to the specific child he has rather than to the general idea of a child. Her mother was Friedel Adler Bergman, a German woman, and her mother died when she was 2 years old. 2 years old. The loss was the loss that organized everything that followed in the interior architecture of the life. Not as a wound that never healed, not in the specific melodramatic register that motherlessness in biography tends to be assigned, but as the first and most fundamental fact of a childhood that was, in its subsequent years, organized around the absence at its center. Her father died when she was 12. She was orphaned at 12. Both parents gone before she was old enough to have had them in the way that children need their parents in the years when they need them most. She was raised by relatives, by her father's sister, and then by her father's brother and his family, in the specific arrangement of family provision that orphaned children received in the Sweden of the 1920s, which was the arrangement of genuine care without the specific quality of the care that the parents would have provided. She was, from early, a person who was going to be somewhere else. Not dissatisfied with what she had, the accounts of her childhood are not the accounts of an unhappy child, and the relatives who raised her were not unkind. But the quality that the subsequent career would use, the quality of being fully present in the situation she was in, while also being, in some fundamental dimension of herself, reaching towards something that the situation did not contain, was present early. She performed. She told stories. She was, in the family settings and in the school settings, the person who was performing even when performing was not what the occasion officially required. She studied at the Royal Dramatic Theatre in Stockholm. She studied with the specific seriousness of someone who has understood that the gift requires the discipline, and that the discipline is not the enemy of the gift, but its necessary companion. She was good. She was noticed. She was offered the opportunity to make Swedish films. The Swedish films came. They were good films in the way of the Swedish cinema of the mid-1930s. The specific quality of the Scandinavian filmmaking tradition that the international cinema would eventually recognize as one of the most significant national traditions in the history of the medium. But that was, in 1935 and 1936, still primarily a local tradition received primarily by local audiences. David O. Selznick saw one of them. This is the specific mechanism of her Hollywood career's beginning. The American producer, who was in the process of assembling the most ambitious production in Hollywood history, who was looking for the specific qualities that his vision of Scarlett O'Hara required, who was seeing everything that was producing anything worth seeing in the international cinema of the late 1930s, saw Ingrid Bergman in a Swedish film called Intermezzo, and understood immediately that what he was looking at was the thing he had been looking for. Not for Scarlett O'Hara, he understood very quickly that what he was looking at was not Scarlett O'Hara. What he was looking at was something that the Hollywood he was making films in had not seen in exactly this form. A quality of natural, unmanaged beauty, of a face that had not been shaped by the Hollywood beauty apparatus into the specific form that the Hollywood beauty apparatus tended to produce. A quality of direct and unaffected screen presence that the European cinema had and that the Hollywood of the late 1930s was not always producing. He brought her to America. He remade Intermezzo with her in the American version, released in 1939. The American version was received as what it was: the introduction of something new to the American cinema, a quality of screen presence that was immediately recognizable as genuinely different from what was already there, and that the audience responded to with the specific, immediate warmth that the audience extends to the things that feel new and genuine simultaneously. The films multiplied. Casablanca in 1942, For Whom the Bell Tolls in 1943, Gaslight in 1944, for which she won the Academy Award for Best Actress, Spellbound in 1945, Notorious in 1946, Joan of Arc in 1948. The career of the 1940s was the career of a woman who was, across a single decade, producing some of the finest performances in the history of American cinema, with a consistency that the careers of most performers do not sustain across a decade of equivalent intensity. She was also, across those years, one of the most beloved public figures in America. Not famous in the ordinary sense, something warmer than famous, something that had to do with the specific quality of her screen presence and the specific way the audience received it, which was personal rather than simply admiring. The letters she received from the American public, the fan mail which she answered with the thoroughness of someone who understood the relationship between the audience's love and the work that had produced it, were the letters of people who felt they knew her in a way that went beyond the ordinary relationship of audience to performer. She was married to Petter Lindström. He was a Swedish doctor, her first husband, whom she had married in 1937 and with whom she had Pia. The marriage was the marriage of two people who had come to America together and who were, in America, in the specific dynamic of the brilliant performer and the professional husband who is in the periphery of the world that the performer's brilliance is organizing. A dynamic that produces, in the marriages that contain it, a quality of imbalance that the love that originally produced the marriage is sometimes not sufficient to sustain. She met Roberto Rossellini. He was an Italian filmmaker, not an American filmmaker in the specific mode of the Hollywood directors she had been working with. Not the Hitchcocks and the Curtises and the studio professionals who made the machinery of the Hollywood film with the specific efficiency of the machinery. He was something different. A filmmaker of a different European tradition organized around the neo-realist aesthetic that Rossellini had been central in developing. The aesthetic that was organized around the documentation of real life, rather than around the construction of the studio version of life. She had seen his film Paisan in 1948. She had been moved by it, specifically moved by it, in the way that the encounter with genuine artistic quality moves people who have the specific sensitivity to recognize it. She wrote to him. She wrote the specific letter that the story of Ingrid Bergman and Roberto Rossellini is most famous for. The letter in which she said she was an actress who spoke Swedish, German, English, and French, who did not speak a word of Italian but who had seen his film and who wanted, if he would consider it, to work with him. He wrote back. He wanted her to come to Italy. She went to Italy. The 1949 scandal is the fact about Ingrid Bergman that the American public of 1949 decided was the defining fact about her, and that it decided this with a specific ferocity and a specific quality of moral outrage that the subsequent decades have provided some context for, but have not fully explained in a way that accounts for the ferocity and the specific quality of the outrage. She and Rossellini became lovers. She became pregnant with his child. She was still married to Petter Lindström. The pregnancy became public. The public response was what the public response was. Enormous, condemnatory, organized around the specific moral framework of the American public of 1949, which was a framework that made a very clear distinction between the public image that had been offered and that the public had received, and the private behavior that had been conducted in ways that contradicted in the image. The condemnation was organized, and it was total, and it was in its specific form, unlike most of the condemnations that the entertainment industry produces even now, let alone in 1949. A United States Senator, Edwin C. Johnson of Colorado, stood on the floor of the United States Senate and condemned Ingrid Bergman as a powerful influence for evil. He called her an apostle of degradation. He introduced a bill that would have required the licensing of actors and the revocation of licenses for moral turpitude. The bill did not pass. The speech was in the congressional record. She was, in other words, not simply the subject of disapproving newspaper columns or the recipient of angry fan letters. She was the subject of a speech on the floor of the United States Senate that described her as an evil influence and that called for legislative action to prevent her kind of influence from continuing. The specific scale of the response, from the Senate to the local editorials to the burning of her photographs and the boycotts of her films, was the scale of a culture organizing itself around the rejection of a person it had previously organized itself around the embrace of, with the specific intensity that the reversal of the embrace produces. She left America. She lived in Italy. She and Rossellini married in 1950 after the divorces from the respective previous spouses had been obtained. They had 3 children together, Robertino, born in 1950, and the twins Isabella and Isotta, born in 1952. Isabella would become, in subsequent decades, a model and actress whose own career would produce her own specific form of public recognition. The children were the children of the Italian years, and the Italian years were the years of the partnership with Rossellini and the neorealist films they made together, and the specific domestic life of the Italian household in the years of the marriage. The films she made with Rossellini were not received with the warmth that the Hollywood films had been received with. Not because the films were without quality, they were films of genuine artistic seriousness, organized around the specific aesthetic that Rossellini had developed and that Ingrid Bergman inhabited, with the specific commitment she brought to everything. But the international audience that received them was not the Hollywood audience that had received the 1940s films, and the reception that the neorealist aesthetic produces is a different reception from the reception that the Hollywood mainstream produces, and the difference was a difference that the career's international profile reflected. The marriage to Rossellini ended in 1957. The ending was, by the accounts of the people who were close to them during the Italian years, the ending of a marriage that had run the specific course that marriages run, when the people in them have found, in the marriage, something that the marriage could provide at the beginning, and that the marriage could not continue to provide in the form the beginning had offered. She has described it, in the memoir and in the interviews, in the specific, careful language of a woman who is being honest about something without performing the honesty. Not bitter, not resentful, but clear about what the marriage had been and what the ending of it was. She came back. The return to America and to American cinema came through the specific mechanism that returns of her kind come through, which is a film project of sufficient quality and sufficient commercial interest that the industry finds the management of the history easier than the foregoing of the project. Anastasia in 1956, in which she played the woman who may or may not be the surviving daughter of the last Russian Tsar, was the film, directed by Anatol Litvak. Produced outside the American studio system in Europe, but received in America as the return of Ingrid Bergman to the American cinema. She won the Academy Award for Best Actress for Anastasia, the second Oscar. The first had been for Gaslight in 1944. The second was for the film that marked the return from the exile that the American public had imposed and that the Senate speech had articulated. The giving of the award was itself a cultural statement, the statement that the exile was over, that the condemnation had run its course, that the American cinema was prepared to receive again what it had spent 7 years rejecting. The subsequent career was the career of a woman who had been received back and who was doing the work in the specific context of the return. Aware of what the return had required and what the years of the exile had contained, and what the specific quality of the welcome back meant for the understanding of what the welcome had been in the first place. Murder on the Orient Express in 1974, for which she won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress. The third Oscar, which is the number that places her in the company of the very few performers who have received the Academy's recognition at that level. The role was a small one, she played the Swedish missionary Greta Olsen, a supporting character in an ensemble film organized around the specific Agatha Christie mystery. And the winning of the Oscar for a small role in an ensemble mystery is itself the statement that the Academy makes when it wants to honor the career rather than the specific performance. Or rather, when it wants to honor the career through the specific performance rather than despite it. She had cancer. The diagnosis came in 1974, the same year as the third Oscar. Breast cancer. The diagnosis and the Oscar were in the same year, and the coincidence of the timing, the highest formal recognition of the career, and the beginning of the medical reality that would end the career, is the specific, ironic coincidence that life occasionally produces without the narrative purpose that fiction would assign it. She continued to work. The working through the cancer years was the working of a woman who had understood, across the years of the career and the exile and the return and the three Oscars, that the work was the thing that organized the self, and that the alternative to the work was the condition of a self that is not organized around the thing that has always organized it, and that the alternative was therefore not an alternative she was prepared to accept while the work was still possible. Autumn Sonata in 1978. Ingmar Bergman, no relation, directed it. She played Charlotte, a concert pianist who visits her daughter for the first time in several years and whose visit produces the confrontation between the mother and the daughter about the specific quality of the mother's attention across the daughter's childhood, which was, in the daughter's account, insufficient, which was, in the mother's, the attention of a person whose life was organized around the work and who gave what she could give in the context of that organization. The role required her to play a mother who was being confronted by her daughter about the years of insufficient presence. She was a woman who had been confronted in her own life by the specific complexity of the relationship between her career and the presences and absences it had required. The years in Italy, the distance from Pia. The specific quality of the motherhood that the career and the marriages and the exile had produced for her children, and that her children had experienced in ways that were not always identical to what she had understood herself to be giving. She gave the role everything it required. The Academy Award nomination, her seventh, was the recognition that the performance deserved. The nomination confirmed what the people who saw the film understood, which was that what Ingmar Bergman had directed and Ingrid Bergman had performed was one of the finest engagements between a filmmaker and a performer in the history of the medium. The cancer progressed through the late 1970s and into the early 1980s. She continued to work. A Woman Called Golda in 1982, the television film in which she played Golda Meir, was the final work, the last performance, made in the specific condition of a woman who is making it in the full knowledge that the making of it is happening in the context of the illness that is progressing, and that the work is what is left to give, because the giving of it is what the life has always been organized around. She won the Emmy Award for A Woman Called Golda. The Emmy is the fourth major performance award, the fourth of the four that the American entertainment industry offers, alongside the Oscar and the Tony and the Grammy. She had the Oscar 3 times, and the Emmy once, and the Tony twice, and the work that had produced those recognitions across 50 years of a career that was, in its full span, one of the most distinguished and most seriously maintained careers in the history of the American and international cinema. The summer of 1982, Danholm Island, she had come to the island for the final weeks. She had been in London, working, as late as the spring of 1982, on things that the illness was allowing her to work on. And she had come to the island because the island was the place she had wanted to be in the final weeks, the specific geography of home, in the way that home means the place you are most yourself, rather than the place you were born. She called her daughter on the 28th of August. She said, "I think it's time." She died on the 29th, her birthday, 67 years old. Now, my friend, I want to sit with you in what the having had everything and the losing of it contains. She had had everything, the specific everything of a career of that specific quality and that specific duration and that specific range. From the Swedish films of the 1930s to the Hollywood films of the 1940s to the Italian films of the Rossellini years to The Return and the third Oscar and the Ingmar Bergman collaboration and the Emmy, the career contained, at its fullest, the entire range of what the performing arts of the 20th century could offer a performer who was serious enough to seek it and gifted enough to find it. She had also lost things. Not the losing of failure, not the losing that comes from inadequacy or from the failure of the work to be what the work needed to be. The losing of a woman whose life was organized around work that required her to be away from the people who needed her to be present, whose 3 marriages ended and whose exile produced the specific quality of absence that the exile's years contained, whose children experienced the mother in the way that the children of people who are fully committed to work of the specific demands that her work made experience the parent, intermittently, in the intense way of the intermittent presence rather than in the continuous way of the continuous one. The Senate speech, the exile, the 7 years in which the American public that had loved her organized itself around the rejection of her. These are the losses that the having had everything contained alongside the having, and they are losses of a kind that the subsequent return and the subsequent recognition and the 3 Oscars did not fully undo, because the undoing of losses of that kind is not within the power of the formal recognition that comes after. She carried all of it to the island. She carried it in the specific way of a woman who has lived 67 years of a life that was fully engaged with the world in the way that the fully engaged life requires, and who is in the final weeks of that engagement, and who is on an island with the light and the water and the specific quality of the northern summer. She called her daughter. She said, "I think it's time." She was right. Sleep well, my friend. And the next time you see her, in Casablanca, in Notorious, in Autumn Sonata, in any of the 50 years of films that were the expression of the work and the career and the life, see the full span of it. Not only the famous films, not only the 1940s glory, the full span. The Swedish beginning and the Hollywood decade and the Italian exile and the return and the Ingmar Bergman film and the Emmy and the island. She had everything. She lost some of it in the way that the living of a fully engaged life requires some things to be lost. She kept working until the summer. Then she went to the island. And she was right that it was time.